The date is August 3rd, 2016. The location is Trivandrum Airport in the southwestern Indian state of Kerala. Emirates Flight 521 was preparing to carry passengers to Dubai, United Arab Emirates. The aircraft that would operate the flight was a Boeing 777-31H. This 777 had been actively flying for 13 years and 5 months. It had a total of 58,000 flight hours and had taken off and landed 13,500 times. The aircraft was equipped with 2 Rolls-Royce engines. There were a total of 282 passengers and 18 crew members on board. There were 2 pilots among the 18-person flight crew. The airplane was ready for flight. The pushback vehicle began to push the aircraft backwards, after which the aircraft completed their taxi on the runway and lined up at the runway for takeoff. At 10:35, the pilots gave full power to the engines and accelerated the airplane on the runway. After gaining momentum on the runway, the aircraft took off at 10:35. After an uneventful 2.5-hour flight, about an hour before their arrival at Dubai Airport, the captain and his co-pilot looked at the approach procedures to runway 12 left and 30 left and briefed each other. In this briefing, they discussed what to do early on in case of a possible overrun. They said that in case of a pass, a flap angle of 20 degrees would be selected, and then they should climb up to 3,000 feet. International airports have their own pass procedures. These procedures are shown on the runway approach maps given to pilots. Before landing on the runway, pilots review these passing procedures just in case. At 11:35 a.m., the United Arab Emirates National Meteorological and Seismological Center issued a wind shear warning affecting all airport runways. Wind shear is the name given to sudden changes in wind speed and direction. It is a weather phenomenon that makes it difficult for airplanes to control during landing on the runway. The warning was issued at 12:00. 6 minutes later, the captain briefed the co-pilots about the possibility of a sudden change in wind speed and direction, and told the co-pilot, "In case of a wind shear, we pass," he said. Afterwards, the pilots started chatting in the cockpit and started to talk about their memories of passing in the past. During this conversation, the co-pilot told that he had experienced a wind shear during landing 3 months ago. In response, the captain said that he had encountered one in Dubai, but it was much lighter. He said that there was a sudden change of 10 knots in the wind speed, so they passed. The conversation ended after about a minute. You will see at the end of the video that this weather event was not the main cause of the accident, and that the captain made a big mistake. At 12:17, as the plane was descending from 16,000 feet, the crew communicated with the tower officer and confirmed that they had received the updated airport report. The captain had experienced wind shear for this runway before, as he frequently takes off and lands in Dubai. Minutes later, the tower officer vectored the aircraft for approach to runway 12 left. Before this, 777, which was approaching the runway, 2 airplanes attempting to land had passed due to adverse weather conditions. However, the pilots of the 777 were not informed by the tower attendant about the previous aircraft's pass. The pilots lowered the landing gear 3 minutes later at 12:34 and completed the preparations and checklists for landing. They then received landing clearance from the tower for runway 12 left and confirmed that they would land. The tower officer informed the pilots that the wind speed was 11 knots at 340 degrees. The captain made a stable approach on autopilot until the pilot reached 1,000 feet. At 930 feet, in case of adverse weather, the captain deactivated the autopilot and continued the approach. However, according to Emirates company policy, pilots must fly in auto-throttle mode at all stages of the flight. This is a system that adjusts the speed of the aircraft according to the speed and direction of the wind, reducing the pilot's workload. In addition, this automatic throttle mode system works separately from the autopilot. As an additional information, the runway directions of the airplanes are given according to where the wind is coming from, and the airplanes land in a way to take the wind from the opposite side. This is called a headwind. The reason for this is that during landing, the wind coming from the head does not affect the landing too much, but the tailwind can create difficult situations for pilots. This Emirates flight was at 750 feet when the wind suddenly changed direction and the headwind turned into a tailwind. After 18 seconds, at 450 feet, a minium sounded automatically, and the captain announced the landing. This minimum warning from the airplane means the lowest altitude it can descend to during the final approach phase before landing on the runway. Passing 190 feet, the co-pilot announced that the wind had increased and was 16 knots from behind. During this time, the captain kept the plane on the landing line and had an average bank of 0.7 degrees. At 115 feet, the co-pilot recalled the tailwind and said it had dropped to 13 knots. The captain replied, "Confirmed," in reply. The captain reduced the pitch of the aircraft from 0.7 to 0.5 degrees by slightly ventilating the nose of the aircraft. Immediately afterwards, the aircraft gave a 100-feet warning. At 12:37, the airplane passed over the tight lines at the beginning of runway 12 left. In the next 4 seconds, the aircraft continued to give information about its altitude. It gave warnings of 50, 40, 30, respectively. At 12:37, after the aircraft had glided 100 meters on the runway, the captain pilot pulled the control stick at an altitude of 40 feet and the aircraft continued to glide. When he pulled the control lever, the airplane experienced a nose lift. When the plane descended to 25 feet, the automatic throttle cut the throttle and idled the enginus. As the airplane soon had to turn over and slow down, the enginus stopped generating power. Within 2 seconds, the airplane's speed dropped, but the wheels were not in contact with the runway. Therefore, the captain pushed the control stick forward 3 times and started to lower the nose down so that the wheels would touch the runway. However, instead of landing, the plane slid to the left due to the wind. Feeling the effect of the wind, the captain immediately tried to recover the situation by moving the control stick to the right. The aircraft banked to the right in response to the captain's action, and this bank caused the right wheel to touch the runway. Shortly after the right wheel, the left wheel also touched the ground, but the captain did not feel that both wheels were on the ground and thought that they were still gliding. This was one of the main causes of the accident. The captain was struggling with the wind and could not feel the wheels touching the runway. Their current speed was 161 knots, but it should have been 1 knot, so this speed was not a big problem. The nose landing gear was also in the air during this time, as it should have been. Seconds later, the captain decided that he could not land, even though he had already landed, and decided to pass. He pressed the pass button in the cockpit. After pressing this button, he called out to the co-pilot, "We are passing." Normally, when this button is pressed, the engines are given full power and the plane is allowed to pass. But if you remember, according to Emirates company policy, the automatic throttle mode, which is forbidden to be turned off during landing, was turned off by the captain pilot at 1,000 feet. Therefore, when the captain pressed the automatic override button, the automation system refused to override. Instead of powering the engines, the automation system thought it was still landing and continued idling. After the captain's decision to pass, the aircraft traveled an average of 700 meters on the runway. The aircraft therefore issued a long landing warning. This warning informed the pilots that there was very little distance to the end of the runway. The pilot then raised the nose of the airplane by pulling up the control lever to pass. Immediately afterwards, the aircraft issued a second long landing warning. The airplane took off a little with its engines in ralentia and set its flap to 2 degrees. The co-pilot said they saw a positive climb angle, and the captain raised the landing gear. Since the engines were idling, the climb started to decrease, and the airplane started to lose speed. When they reached off feet, the plane started to lose altitude. The captain still hadn't realized what the problem was. Due to the rapid descent, a descent warning started coming from the airplane. The captain then manually applied power to both engines. Had he taken this action earlier, perhaps the accident would never have happened. It does not take a second for the engines to generate power. It takes some time. For this reason, even though the captain gave full powers to the engines, the plane was already descending. Unable to hold the air, the plane was descending rapidly. The captain made another wrong move and raised the nose of the airplane, which already had a low speed, causing the speed to drop even more. Finally, the fuselage hit the ground at 124 knots. The plane turned 120 degrees to the right and slid 800 meters. The number 2 engine on the right broke off and was dragged along with the wreckage. Fortunately, everyone on board survived and was to be safely evacuated. But 9 minutes after the crash, while the captain, pilot, and cabin crew were checking to see if there were any passengers on board, flames reached the central fuel tank and an explosion occurred. This explosion caused the death of a firefighter. After the explosion, the captain, the cabin crew, and 30 people were still unable to leave the plane, and these 32 people were taken out of the plane injured. Fortunately, none of these injured people lost their lives. Thank you for watching me.